Good evening and welcome. I'm Charles Overby, chairman of the Overby Center for Southern Journalism and Politics, and we're just delighted you would join us this evening for what I know is going to be a stimulating conversation. First, I'd like to say that our last program of the spring is 2 weeks from tonight, and we are going to have a terrific program. Federal District Judge Bill Alsop, who is in San Francisco, but went to Provine with me, and former Democratic Party Chairman Danny Cupid, who also went to Provine with me, will be here to talk about the days of segregation when Bill was growing up and how he overcame that very closed society and the evolution of Bill Alsop into one of the most now liberal federal judges in the country. But tonight, we have two really distinguished people with us to be involved in a conversation with Curtis Wilkie and me. Stuart Stevens, right here to my left, and he probably is to my left. Stuart has made a reputation for himself on many fronts. Politically, he's been an outstanding political consultant, and he had the distinction of being the main strategist for Mitt Romney, who should have won.
We lost.
He lost. So he was with Mitt Romney then, continues to be close to Mitt Romney. He's a TV writer. He's written books. He and David Cruz, who is here, traveled throughout China, and Stuart wrote a great book about that. He's a Renaissance man, and he's got some good insights for tonight. David Baria, a lot of y'all know him. He ran for the Senate against Roger Wicker. He lost also, but he ran a good campaign. He's the Democratic leader of the Mississippi House of Representatives. And he announced recently that he's going to retire at the end of the year. He's from down on the coast and has done a lot of things. He's a lawyer, and he's going to provide some good insights tonight as well. The whole purpose of this program tonight is to study the question about whether centrist politics is relevant today. Curtis and I were talking in his office, which is like a museum. Go up there and see it sometime. He's not a museum, but his office is. We were talking about how things seem to be changing, and it used to be that the center governed how we did. And Curtis, before we start asking Stuart and David questions, I'd like to get your insight into your views about the center and will it hold?
Well, it doesn't seem to be holding now. That's the whole purpose of our exercise tonight. Where did it go? What's happened? As you've said, Charles and I both covered national politics for years, and our elections were invariably decided by who won the center. Both parties have a base of whatever it's going to be, 30, 35, 40%. They're going to vote that way regardless, and the 20, 25, 30% in the middle are the ones who decide the election. And that center certainly seems to be diminishing, and people are being driven to extremes on both sides, both the right and the left. And we have this poisonous situation in Washington where Republicans
Democrats
don't deal with each other.
So Curtis, tell people to illustrate this problem about your introducing Thad Cochran to our class and how he took exception to your introduction.
Thad agreed to speak to a class Charles and I teach each fall, and I introduced Thad, who's an old friend, first name basis, as a moderate Republican, and he quickly corrected me. Of course, he was running for re-election that year, and it was being challenged by a Tea Party candidate, and he says, "Oh no, I'm not a moderate," you know, and so it's demonizing a Republican to call him a moderate, and the Democrats are accustomed to being demonized for being left-wing radicals themselves, and it's more exacerbated with each year.
I want to ask David and Stuart about the issue of centrist politics, moderate candidates on a statewide basis and a national basis. David, we'll start with you. Tell us about where you think the centrist movement is in Mississippi, or does it exist?
Well, I think it exists solely in the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, my colleagues on the right, the Republican Party, they find that they have to run so far to the right so that they don't know where the center is anymore, because they're in constant fear that somebody farther to the right is going to primary them. And so you see people who would otherwise be centrists who take these hard right positions and, like the example of Senator Cochran, refuse to be called moderate. They must be arch conservative. They've got to be right of Attila the Hun if they want to survive their primary. Now, I'd like to think that all the problems are in the Republican Party and not the Democratic Party. We've certainly got our set of problems as well, and we get pushed likewise farther to the left in our primaries, particularly of late when you see more and more people voting in the Republican primary. So you get what people say is a true Democratic vote, and so you have to cleave farther and farther to the left. And you're exactly right, it opens up the center. But I always have hope, and I think that in this election year you're going to see a centrist Democrat take the governor's mansion. And I've got my fingers and my toes crossed, but I think that Jim Hood has a very good chance to take the governor's mansion, and he is truly a centrist politician. He's a centrist Democrat. He could be just as easily identified as a centrist Republican, I think.
Stuart, how do you see it on a national level?
Well, I think there are examples, like we were talking about earlier, of governors who still very much govern from the center. Larry Hogan in Maryland is an example. He's almost seen as a nonpartisan figure. I mean, he got record high support for Republican of African Americans. Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, 14% Republican. He is like the most popular governor in America, and he's a Republican. Phil Scott in Vermont. They're out there, but I think it's distinct from the culture of the federal congressional holding candidates now and office holders. And I think it's very disturbing. I think there's two trends in the Republican Party which will ultimately be fatal. One is that the Republican Party has increasingly become a white person's party. And, you know, just if you look ahead, unless white people figure out how to quit dying, it's not very optimistic. And I think it's become a party that has played far too much to the extremes. And, you know, I did George Bush's campaign and moved down to Austin in '99, wrote a book about it. And I don't think George Bush could win a Republican primary now. I mean, we ran on compassionate conservatism, which we got a lot of grief for, because people said, well, you mean conservatism isn't compassionate. But it was sort of self-evident that we felt the need to do this. And he got 2004, 42%, 41 and change of Hispanic vote. And now we're down to 27 and probably less. So unlike David, I don't particularly have hope. I'm not very optimistic about it, and I'm not sure where it's going to go.
You would consider Mitt Romney a moderate?
Well, it depends on how you define these things. I mean, I think he's certainly moderate in his approach to life. He's a listener. He's someone who gathers information, who makes decisions, who he loves to be in situations where one person will argue a point, another person will argue, then you reverse it to sort of stress test that point, you know. He doesn't immediately lurch to an ideological solution, But Mitt is very much a conservative. He's a cultural conservative. But I look at him as sort of the best part of conservatism. It comes through, I think, a belief, sort of fundamental beliefs about smaller government and character counts and personal responsibility and all of these things that at one time were touchstones for Republicans. But his voting record will be conservative, but his tone is, he's someone who very much believes in compromise.
Are we talking about a difference here when we talk about moderation, style versus policy, or is it all wrapped up together?
I think it's all wrapped up together. I mean, the problem among many with Donald Trump is that he has demonized governing, basically. I mean, to govern, you have to compromise. That's the art of governing. And that is, it was a trend, but he escalated and he sort of weaponized it. I mean, you have someone who ran on a religious test to enter the United States, Muslim ban. And there's just no room for any of the process that is governing. So where do we end up? I mean, what has Trump really done? We don't have a wall. We have record high deficits, disastrous foreign policy relationships. And he hasn't really been tested by a crisis. So I think leaders, we're a very personality-driven country, and I think leaders set the tone for parties. I mean, look what Kennedy did for the Democratic Party. So to me, I look at Donald Trump, it's as if George Wallace won the Democratic nomination and the Democratic Party rallied around George Wallace. What would that have done for the Democratic Party? It would have changed it.
So, cut to the chase, what's caused this crazy realignment that the parties are going this way and they're taking the center with them? Is it cable TV? Is it
Facebook?
I don't know.
I think a big part of it is the way we redistrict and gerrymander districts to create safe districts for Democrats and Republican candidates. So you find you have a district that is going to elect a Democrat. That Democrat has to be the farthest Democrat to the left. Likewise, when you have a Republican district, they have to be the farthest to the right, most far to the right. I know you're all journalists. I don't want to be graded on my syntax here. But the problem with that is that there aren't enough districts that are in play in any given election, in my opinion. Now, that's not the only problem, but I do think that social media has driven the polls farther apart. And obviously, cable news, you got Fox on one end, and you got MSNBC or CNN, I guess, on the other end. And people have their channel. It's not like watching Walter Cronkite every night at 6 p.m. You go to your channel and you get the news you want to hear, and it sort of plays to your bias. It confirms your bias. So I think that all of those are problems.
The other thing that people, I think, underestimate because not really involved in they have lives and they're not really involved in politics, is fundraising. You look at Bernie Sanders. So, I mean, I can remember I went to Middlebury College in Vermont. I can remember riding my bicycle down the main street in Burlington, and there was this guy out there yelling about rent control. It was like, who is this guy? It was Bernie Sanders. And he won by 10 votes. And, say what you will about Bernie Sanders. He's a guy who's never gotten more than 190,000 votes. The campaign that he ran in 2016 was an incredible piece of campaign art. So they're raising over $1 million a day in the mail without fundraisers, or online without fundraisers. So people always talk like, when's the Bernie Sanders should get out? Hillary Clinton's going to win. It was like, are you kidding me? You're in a campaign that's getting $1 million a day. I mean, you think you're going to walk away? Campaigns end when they run out of money, not when they want to end. And you look at the same, what fundraising base is there for moderate Republicans? It is much more to conservative, that sort of grassroots thing. I've sort of become radicalized on this, and I would go to federal funding for all federal elections. We used to have it in the presidential race. I'm one of the few guys around that has done races when we're in the federal system, when we're not. I think it's much better. It was much better in the federal system, where both candidates got the same amount of money. And I think we're about to have the first incumbent president reelected, or the second, Barack Obama was, not in the federal funding system. And I think just think about it. You're going to have the Democrats are going to beat each other up. They're going to come out of the primary probably broke, like everybody does.
Explain to the audience why you see the federal system to be a good system and what it is.
Well, in '76, after post-Watergate, we passed campaign finance reforms, which one of the key elements was federal funding for presidential races. So it literally meant that when you walked off the stage after giving your acceptance speech, there was an official there from the Treasury Department who gave you a check. That check escalated every month, but around $80 million. You got that under the agreement that you wouldn't raise any more money. It was always a check. It was always like, can't you wire this? It's like, no, we only do checks. And that's why if you look at the convention dates, like in the Bush campaign, it wasn't exactly brilliant. We realized, okay, we're going to get the same amount of money. We should have the convention as late as possible, because then we're going to spend it in less time. So both candidates then had the same amount of money. So you didn't do fundraising after you got this. And you had much less spending. So Barack Obama, I think it's the most unfortunate part of his legacy. He was the first to step out of the federal funding system. And if you read David Plouffe, his campaign manager's book about it, The Audacity to Win, David is very honest about it. He just says, look, we did it because we knew we could raise like ungodly amounts of money. So Barack Obama raised $735 million. McCain stayed in the system, so he had $83 million. So, you'll never, the history of these campaign finance reforms, though, it's very hard once somebody steps out to ever get the genie back in the bottle. But I thought when Barack Obama stepped out of it that we probably were abolishing the 4-year presidential term without realizing it. Because it's just such a huge advantage. An incumbent president, Democrat or Republican, can raise basically unlimited money. And I think it'll be very, money means less now, everybody says. I don't know. It seems to mean a lot.
And you have the Citizens United decision that opens up.
Yeah, that's the big thing. Everybody says Citizens United, so that means there would have been unlimited money anyway. I still would go to federal funding for all elections, which will probably never happen, but I think it would be a better system than we have now.
David,
I agree with that.
Can money follow moderates in Mississippi?
It can if it's smart money. In other words, if there's an opportunity to win, and I think that there will be money that follows Jim Hood because he's got the polling data that shows that he has an opportunity to win. He's raised a sufficient amount to show that he's a good fundraiser and he can build on that. He's got, I think, 16 years in the Attorney General's role. He's very, very popular in this state. And now that Chief Justice Wyler has gotten in the Republican primary, there's this belief that he's going to help Tate spend some of his money. And so it provides more parity when ultimately the two of them are the Republican and Democrat nominees, which everybody still seems to think is going to happen. So I think it can, and I consider myself a moderate, and I was able to outraise a couple of my opponents, though the last one I think they spent about $350,000 to my $125. So, but I think money can follow the moderate.
I have a question. If you bring national politics into it, David, and apply it to Mississippi, how does the image of the National Democratic Party, which is going further to the, I should demonstrate with my left hand, further to the left almost every day, how does that affect a candidate running in Mississippi?
Well, it absolutely hurts the Democratic candidate in most places around the state. And that, when I say most, I mean like 98%. They've done that. They did that to me in my legislative races. They would send out mailers with, for instance, a photograph of me playing cards with Barack Obama. You know, they everything they can do to tie you to Nancy Pelosi.
Oh yeah, they love to use the name Pelosi, and it makes it sound like you're a member of the mafia. It's very sinister pronunciation.
Well, I remember when Congressman Palazzo was running against Congressman Gene Taylor, it seemed to me that he never used his own name. It was Fire Pelosi. And that his entire campaign was Fire Pelosi, and it worked. So yes, tying Mississippi Democrats to national Democrats is effective. It does damage.
But you know, the flip side of that is look at the midterms, which were a disaster for Republicans because of Donald Trump. So that nationalization cuts both ways, and I think Republicans kidded themselves that you look at Trump's numbers, that it wouldn't hurt. And I think it'll continue to hurt.
So David mentioned social media, Stuart. You live in social media. You blog and you're seen all over different places. What's the impact of social media on this whole issue of extremism versus moderation?
Well, I think David went right to it. I mean, social media is we used to consume information, I think, more to inform opinions than confirm opinions. And there are no gatekeepers now. And there's a whole vast billion dollar industry of logarithms that are designed to give you information of what you already believe. I mean, it's no different than if you go shopping for a raincoat on Amazon, you're going to get a lot of ads for raincoats. And so if you're a conservative and you go and you read conservative stuff, you're going to get a lot more conservative stuff. And it becomes sort of self-perpetuating, where you have to actively step out of that to try to read other opinions. And I think it's absolutely toxic. I don't know what the answer to it is. Republican, one of the big things that's happened with the Republican Party, it's become the victim's party. Republicans used to try to paint Democrats as sort of victim shoppers. Now, I mean, Donald Trump is the greatest victim ever, and it's permeated down through. So there's this myth out there that somehow social media is tilting the deck against conservatives, which I think is absolutely nonsense. But I don't know. I mean, we're in one of these great transitional periods where ultimately it'll probably level out. But right now, I think it's very corrosive.
So you're a great student of politics. Is Trump a one-time anomaly, or is there a new normal coming from this?
Well, I'm very pessimistic about the Republican Party. As we were talking, a lot of people were wrong about Donald Trump in 2016, but probably, I was more wrong than anyone. And
stop right there. Stuart was speaking to the class that Curtis and I taught, and I've always admired Stuart's intelligence, and so he said something that caused me then to go tell all my friends the same thing. He said that
don't ever make that mistake.
that Donald Trump would not make it past the Iowa caucuses. And I thought that was such an intelligent thing. I told everybody that.
I thought that was very intelligent.
So I didn't mean to interrupt. Continue. Is it an anomaly, or this is going to continue?
Well, there's two ways to look at this. There's one way to look at it that Donald Trump hijacked the Republican Party and kind of took it in another direction. So another way to look at it is that the modern Republican Party was more like Donald Trump than it wanted to admit for sort of marketing purposes. I increasingly think evidence points to the latter. You look at the party that I was drawn to, which was personal responsibility, character counts, smaller government, strong on Russia, pro-immigration. Reagan did a lot of great things. I mean, that party doesn't exist. And how do you abandon deeply held beliefs? It probably means you didn't deeply hold them. So I think what's really distressing about Donald Trump is I don't know how you unsay these things. So you remember, I mean, both of you guys remember, before 1964, Republican presidential candidates could get 30 to 35% of the black vote. That's not great, but you're at 35, maybe, you know, you get really work at it, you get to 40, you know, I mean, you're in the game. After 64, the civil opposition from a lot of Southern Democrats who then became Republicans, but Republican opposition to the Civil Rights Act, it fell off a cliff. So it's at 9% now, and it's never come back. I don't see any reason why that's not happening with all non-white voters now. And, you know, at a time of white nationalism, as a crisis, we have a president who probably is white and probably proclaims himself a nationalist. I think people hear this stuff. And you look at young voters, and you look at Republican numbers among young voters, and they're apocalyptic. I don't really know where that ends. I think probably you have to lose a lot to force yourself to change. But I don't. I think even if Trump lost, and I increasingly don't think Donald Trump will lose, the impact of sort of what Trump has done is going to be so lasting that I don't know how you get back to the part. I mean, like in the Bush world, I mean, it wasn't like we aspired to be better. I mean, it wasn't like, you know, we played on the dark side too much and made mistakes. But at least in our best days, we wanted to be something better than we were. And there's none of that in Donald Trump's world. There's no aspiration to be something better. And it's a white grievance party. And I think that's very, very troubling.
David, is Trump a plus for Democrats in Mississippi or a minus?
Oh, I think he's a plus for Democrats all over the country. He's better at party building than we ever have been at it ourselves. But even with that, I mean, I'm an American first, and I'm a person who cares about my country and the future of my country. And I have a 10-year-old son, and I care that he sees his president demeaning people, demeaning other politicians, demeaning institutions like the press and the judiciary. This bothers me terribly, and I pray that he is a one-term president, and it's a, you know, we can move on from this. But I fear that, as Stuart says, the damage that he is doing to the American psyche and to American politics and American institutions is going to take quite some time to unwind. I want to make you feel a little better, though, Stuart. In 2016, I had a 19 and a 20-year-old daughter, both voting age, and they were worried about Donald Trump. And I said, don't worry, there's no way this guy is going to be elected president. I said, but even, you know, his running is in fact a good thing, because he's bringing these skeletons out of the closet, and we need to get these things, these issues out on the table so the American public can see that they're there and discuss them, and we'll all be better afterwards. I'm still holding out hope that once we get through this, we'll all be better afterwards, but it's, you know, Stuart, you're worrying me, telling me that he's going to be reelected.
Well, I mean...
Wait a minute, I don't think he said that to this group. I was going to ask you, is having made such bold, memorable predictions here at Oxford, is Trump going to be a one-term president?
Well, let's just go through a couple of facts. So we're talking about federal funding system, started in '76, ended in 2008. So under the federal funding system had a lot of intent, clean up money, but also to level the playing field. You give both candidates the same amount of money, it levels the playing field. So Carter lost under the federal funding system. Bush lost under the federal funding system. But if you look at the last incumbent president to lose who wasn't in the federal funding system, it's Herbert Hoover. And he had a bad year. I think that is very cautionary. Now, the other sort of leading indicator is whether or not a president is primaried. I mean, if you live in a world where Bernie Sanders ran against Barack Obama in 2012, that would have helped Mitt Romney, in all likelihood. Pat Buchanan in '92 did hurt George Bush. It looks like, he hasn't announced, he may not, but former Governor William Weld of Massachusetts is going to primary Donald Trump. I worked in all of Governor Weld's races. That's where I met Curtis when he was covering Weld race. That'll be very telling to see what happens. I think Weld is a perfect candidate to run against Donald Trump because he represents everything that Donald Trump isn't. I don't know. I mean, who's going to win the Democratic primary?
I have no idea. Which one of the 20 candidates will win?
Well, it's a little reverse because we had the plethora of Republican candidates last time, and now you have it on the Democratic side. So you haven't quite gotten to the finish line on my question, is Trump going to be a one-term president?
I would predict now that Donald Trump will be reelected.
Wow.
Right.
David, you're a creature of the legislative system. What role does the party caucus have in, firming up this partisanship we see that, you see in both parties in Congress? I don't know how it works in Jackson, but there's a real hard line that's been adopted, and you damn well better vote the way the caucus says, or you're going to be ostracized from your own party.
Of course, I'm not in that caucus, but you're talking about the leadership of the Republican caucus on both ends of the Capitol, and I've written about this in the last few years. It is a top-down organization that is run like a military unit, and the Speaker's in charge in the House and the Lieutenant Governor's in charge in the Senate, and what they say goes. They control the committee process, they appoint the chairs, they appoint the members to the committee. Every committee has a safe majority of Republicans in both chambers. And those chairmen can't bring legislation out unless the Speaker or the Lieutenant Governor allows it to happen. And likewise, they must bring out legislation that they're told to bring out. And before they'll bring anything to the floor, they go to caucus and they talk about it, and they make sure that a majority of the caucus, their caucus, supports it before they bring it to the floor. So they're not even talking to Democrats up until the point where they're out on the floor with a piece of legislation. And then they have super majorities in both chambers, so they really don't need any Democratic votes to pass anything. I think it was called the Hastert rule at some point that they're using. I may be wrong about that, but
they still do, even though he turned out to be a child molester.
Right. But it's a hard line operation, and if you step out of line, one of the first things that the Republican Speaker did when he became Speaker in 2012, we have this big board that has every member's name on it, and it was alphabetized, and when you vote, there is a light that lights up. If you vote yes, it lights up green. If you vote no, it lights up red. And I think yellow if you vote present or you're absent. And he separated the board, Democrats and Republicans. And we thought initially, well, he's doing that so he can watch us Democrats. But that wasn't the reason. The reason they did that is so they could see when a Republican steps out of line, because it's glaringly obvious. If all the Republicans are voting aye and it's green, there's one red dot, you can go right to that name, and pretty soon you'll see that member get up from his chair and he's walking to the principal's office and the Speaker's office to get his arm twisted or her arm twisted. And so it's difficult because year after year I go and sit down with the Speaker as the minority leader and say, look, there are a couple of big issues here. We would like to work together with you on this. Just let us be participants in this process. And I get a nod and okay, thank you for coming, and then there's never any discussion after that.
So what happened to the good old days in Washington when the Democratic Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, played golf at least once a week with the Republican Minority Leader Bob Michel? It's gone.
And there's none of that happening at the Mississippi Capitol, I can assure you.
Nor in Washington.
But I think at the root of this, and this is sort of a dangerous territory to go in, but I think it's increasingly obvious, is race. Because so as the Republican Party becomes increasingly unaccessible by non-white voters, if you're sitting there and you know that regardless of what you're going to do as a Republican, you're not going to get many non-white votes, you do this election cycle after election cycle, you learn how to talk to white voters. I mean, it's just the market. You get better at that. So you look in 1980, Ronald Reagan got 57% of the white vote. He won 44 states. So Mitt Romney won 57% of the white vote and lost. Donald Trump was able to win, but it's a very freakish election. I mean, Donald Trump got 46.1% of the vote. Mitt Romney got 47.2%. So what is the difference? The difference is just non-white vote decreased in 2016, and third-party vote went up a little, just enough. But I think until the Republican Party can become more of a party that represents what America is and increasingly is becoming, I don't think that they're going to have market forces that are giving them incentives to compromise like that. And I think that's a terrible, terrible for governing, and it's terrible for our politics. And I'm not sure how to get out of it.
Well, I was going to ask that. We're going to go to the audience to join this conversation in just a minute. But rather than just tilt at windmills, let's look at some solutions. You both study politics. What needs to happen to bring the center back and the moderate back into reality?
Well, I think you have to have courageous individuals who are willing to stand up and do what's right, despite what their party elders and their party leaders insist upon them doing. And my example, the only example I can use, is what happens at the Capitol. I have Republican colleagues come up to me on the floor while we're debating legislation all the time and say, "Hey, Baria, this is a really bad bill. Do you think y'all can kill it?" And I say, well, yes, if you'll vote with us and get a couple of your colleagues, we can kill this. Oh, no, I can't do that. This is the Speaker's bill. You have to have some courage. You have to be able to stand up and say, this is wrong, and I'm going to vote against it. But to the point of African-American voters moving completely away from Republican candidates, white Republican candidates, you have to earn their trust, I think. And I was able to do that in my Senate campaign because I had worked with a lot of my African-American colleagues for years. I had earned their trust. They knew that I was going to do what I said I was going to do, and that I cared about their lives and their children and their community. And so they endorsed me. And then not only did they endorse me, but they went out and worked hard for me in their districts. And so there's a process. I think you have to earn trust of every voter. But one thing Republican moderates are going to need to do is to be courageous and then earn the trust of minority voters.
Stuart?
That's why I'm pessimistic. Because I just, I don't know the path there. I don't know, it's not just about words, it's also about actions. So it wasn't that Republican Party became more overtly racist in 1964, it was how they voted. They voted against the Civil Rights Act. And, African Americans got that. And I think you have to be willing to look at the underlying policies and admit that Republican solutions have not been attractive to increasingly non-white voters. It's not just the words. I think words are a toxic weaponizing element of it. But if you look at these last tax cuts, they greatly benefited the wealthy across the board. I look at the Alabama Senate race. I think it's a fascinating race. So everybody says, well, this is sort of encouraging. A guy who's like a racist and an alleged child molester didn't win the Senate race. But 67% of the white voters in Alabama voted for him. So they're saying, okay, we'll take the guy who's a racist and a child molester over Democrat. I mean, what saved Alabama, not for the first time, were black voters, particularly black women, and the numbers that they voted in. But I find it both encouraging, at least more lost, but also discouraging, because if you can't get a majority of white voters to support a reasonable Democrat versus a child molester, how do you get there? And I don't know. I think it's very cautionary and troubling. I mean, ultimately, if the Republican Party is going to survive, it's going to have to find a path to do that. Survive as a national party. If you look at California, so there's this idea California pretends what happens in America. So Republicans are now the third largest party in California. It's kind of mind-boggling. You think about Reagan, you think about, independents have eclipsed Republicans. and it's going to be worse in the next election. It's just going to get worse. So that's 1 out of 9 voters in the country. You know, how do you write off 1 out of 9 voters in the country and govern as a national party? I'm not sure.
Let's go to the audience to join this conversation. Who'd like to go first? Yes, sir. And we'll repeat the question so that...
Listen, Stuart, do the two extremes eventually push a third party to arise from the middle?
Repeat the question.
Well, do the two extremes eventually push a third party? So I had a lot of friends who were involved in Mike Bloomberg's effort to consider running for the president in 2016. I wasn't, but these are really smart people. So it's sort of fascinating. Their commission from Bloomberg was, my first check will be $2 billion. So this is someone that has 40 billion liquid, they think. So the first check will be $2 billion. So that gets you over the hump of a lot of third parties, right? Like you can't raise money because you don't have the info. And they sat in a room and they couldn't figure a way to get to 270. And Bloomberg didn't run because it ultimately would go to benefit a Democrat. I mean, benefit Trump because Bloomberg was a liberal, but Bloomberg was white, and he was going to take votes out of New York. And I'm very pessimistic about a third party winning nationally in the presidential race as long as we have the Electoral College. Because if you can't get to 270, then it goes to the House. So you're going to have Democrat, you're an independent, you're going to just run against a Democrat and Republican. You go to the House, it's full of Democrat and Republicans. You just have probably been running a campaign, a lot of which was like beating the hell out of Democrats and Republicans and saying we need a third way. And then you're going to get to a body full of Democrats and Republicans, are they going to vote for you? I'm thinking not. I think Democrats will vote for Democrats, Republicans will vote for Republicans. As long as we have the Electoral College, I don't think that there is a chance. Now, third parties have a lot of impact. I mean, third parties ultimately elected, you can make a case, they elected George Bush, Nader did. You can make a case that Jill Stein elected Donald Trump. So it's not like they aren't important. I mean, Bernie Sanders isn't a Democrat, for heaven's sakes. I mean, I live a lot in Vermont, and the Democratic Party hates the guy. You know, he won't run as a Democrat. But as far as there being a national party, I think the history would show that parties change, but the emergence of a new party, I think, is very unlikely.
David, do you agree with that?
Well, again, I'd have to focus on what I know, which is state politics. And I think that there is a much better chance in a state like Mississippi to see the emergence of an independent party or some other, an independent party by some other name, and it having a real impact and maybe even electing a governor. I have my colleagues on both sides of the aisle always are talking about switching to the independent, to becoming an independent. My desk mate, Steve Holland, this year is running independent instead of a Democrat. He's been in the House 36 years.
But is that because they're trying to get away from the Democratic Party label?
No, this is because he's got a primary opponent and he wants to be on the ballot in November. Right. So he's worried about not surviving his primary. And this is, again, someone who's been around for 36 years and is a household name, I think, in Mississippi. And there are Republicans who tell me the same thing all the time. I don't know if they gain the prominence and have enough following to win something like the governor's mansion, but I think an independent can win a legislative seat. And likewise, I think an independent can win a congressional seat. But it's a long shot to win the presidency and maybe even an impossibility with the Electoral College.
So I'll just be, in California, I just did a race for a guy named Steve Poizner. He ran for insurance commissioner in California, which is actually a big deal in California. Steve had been insurance commissioner before as a Republican. He then ran for governor as a Republican and got completely disgusted with the Republican Party. So this time he ran as an independent. So, you know, they have this system in California where the top 2 vote getters advance. It could be 2 Democrats, it could be 2 Republicans. He lost, but he got more independent votes than anybody else in modern history running. He was endorsed by every newspaper in the state. He's a really smart guy, running against a pretty weak Democrat. But it was encouraging that you could see, independents in California are actually called MPP, no party preference. But it was, you could see a path where I think in California, independents will start winning instead of Republicans. And maybe that'll lead to something.
Does that California system of basically no primaries, is that one answer to this issue of centrist?
I don't know, man. You know, they have that in Louisiana, and it was basically invented in Louisiana to stop African Americans from winning statewide office. And it seems to have worked like a charm. Because you get, you know, that what they call jungle primary. So you can get an African American who'll get into the runoff, but then there's an African American against a white person, and that white person seems to win. So I've been more skeptical on it based on Louisiana example, but probably in California, I think it's probably been beneficial. Stop people from playing as much to the extremes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Louisiana system produced David Duke and Edwin Edwards, and they both wound up in prison.
Right.
That was the Vote for the Crook campaign, right?
That's right, yeah.
Got a question up there?
Yes. Charlie.
David, I think this is a comment on the governor's race. Bill Wyler seems to be, if there's such thing as a moderate Republican in Mississippi, he seems certainly to be a lot more moderate than Tate Reeves. Does he have any chance, and is he moderate?
So the question is about the governor's race. David?
Yeah, just to repeat, the question was asking me to comment on Justice Wyler's chances in the Republican primary and whether he has a chance to go on and win the governor's race, and is he really a moderate? You think he?
He's taken, he's for Medicaid expansion.
Right. I think everybody is who's running now except for Tate Reeves. But to your question, I've known Justice Wyler my entire legal career, which is 29 years now, and I have great respect for him. I think he's been an excellent jurist. And there was some talk about him entering the race in 2015. And back then, the talk was that he was going to enter the race as a Democrat. And of course, this time he's entered the race, and he's entered the race on the Republican side. I think that he truly is a moderate, and I think that he has the ability to garner both Democrat and Republican votes. His problem this time around is I think that he waited way too long to get into the race. And he may be banking a little too much on name recognition. And if I was talking to someone outside, if you're not my age or older, I'm 56, then you probably don't remember Governor Wyler, who was governor in 1972 to 76 or something around that time period.
1971.
Yeah, so if you're under 50, you probably have no recollection of a governor named Wyler in the state of Mississippi. So there's not going to be much name recognition. You have to buy that in the state of Mississippi as a politician, and it costs you about $1 million to buy name recognition. So he's way behind. Tate Reeves has something close to $7 million, and I think that he will spend all that he has to make sure that he wins that primary. So I think that Reeves wins the primary and Wyler doesn't make it. Now there may be a runoff, although I doubt it. You have one of my colleagues from up in DeSoto County, Robert Foster, who is running also in the Republican primary, and there may be a couple of other lesser knowns. They will make Tate spend some money, but I think ultimately Tate Reeves wins that primary.
Thank you for the question. Yes, in the back. Yes, ma'am.
A two-part question. Do you believe, or do you think that there's evidence of erosion of voting rights nationally? And if so, do you think that that influences the polarity in politics?
Stuart?
I think there is a reduction in voting rights, and I think it's very troubling. I'm sort of a radical on this. I think, you know, we should register people automatically when they're 18. I even kind of like the Australian system where they fine you if you don't vote. But I realize I'm like a nut, and nobody will be for that. It's often looked at like North Carolina as an example. But honestly, you know, there's a lot of states that have really screwed up voting systems, more states than not. If you look at New York State, remember the Clinton-Sanders primary, and that tens of thousands of votes weren't counted or disappeared. New York doesn't have early voting at all. So if early voting becomes sort of a test of voting access, you know, Georgia has more early voting than New York. So, you know, the dirty little secret of voter fraud is it doesn't really exist, but there are problems with voting, which primarily happen in low-income places because they don't spend enough money. You know, voting systems are one of the cases where money does solve the problem. And you need more voting places, you need more people working the polls, you need to be more open. But we need to make it easier to vote. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. I don't know of a race where there was voter fraud that mattered. I mean, there's always a little, I mean, you can't say it's not voter fraud, but it would be like deciding that you were going to prioritize, national health system was going to, disease control was going to prioritize elephantitis in America instead of cancer. It's just not an issue. And I think there's a lot of race baiting talking about it.
Stuart, you said you're for more access and more openness in voting. Would you endorse what state of Washington and a few others have done in terms of mail-in votes?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Yes is the answer. I'm for that. Though I'm sort of sentimental about one day when everybody votes. I mean, if I ruled the world, I would make probably 2 days voting for national elections on a weekend or a holiday. And I'm for that because things happen late in campaigns. And you can't get your vote back. So, you know, you start voting 3 weeks out, you have debates, oftentimes, you know, after you voted. You know, famously in 2000, I was running for George Bush and the DWI thing came out on Saturday before the election. You had the Access Hollywood stuff, and there's people in America that already voted when that came out. So, on the whole, it's better than not. But I think there's something about a civic coming together of going to vote that is a powerful sort of bonding. And I wish that we could encourage that. I think we're better off the more people vote on election day.
I could not agree more with virtually everything that Stuart just said. I believe that we should have, election day should be a national holiday, at least for national elections. And I do think that voting rights in America have been eroded. And the reason or the basis for eroding those rights through things like closing some polling places and voter ID requirements and other things that you've heard about is this alleged voter fraud. And I think that it's virtually non-existent everywhere in America. I can tell you there are no perfect elections, and I can give you an example of my first election, which was in 2007, right at 2 years after Katrina. Almost every polling place was in a little wooden hut with a window unit air conditioner, and these folks who had to work all day for very, very little pay in terrible conditions did the best they could in Hancock County, Mississippi, yet there was still a contest, so I had to go through an election contest before I could be seated, and there were some imperfections, but there was no voter fraud. It's just a system that's not perfect.
Right.
And what we ought to be doing in America is encouraging more people to vote, not discouraging people from voting and putting up roadblocks to voting. I agree 100% that everybody ought to be automatically registered when they turn 18, and then if they do something to lose that right, then we can talk about taking that away. But otherwise, everybody should vote and be encouraged to vote.
So what was the margin in your race?
My first race?
The one that was contested?
I won by 37 votes. They call me Landslide Baria.
Out of how many?
Not a lot. It was probably 6,000 votes.
Was there a question up here? Yes, sir.
My name is Tyler Yarbrough. I'm a sophomore public policy leadership major in Clarksdale. And so often I think of the question of, well, I think like America, we're in an era, a period where we're really questioning our national identity. Like, what does it mean to be an American? And when you really look at just like how that manifests itself, like with like the Muslim man, or just the questioning of like fundamental like rights of like healthcare, but even with like an organization like ICE that will arrest someone like 21 Savage, a rapper from Atlanta, who came here when he was 10 and deporting him, but also just how he has like created music that has been like that we call like American music. Mm-hmm. So, but also just tying all of that into like this question around like race and how it plays into like our politics and everything too. So, how big of a problem do you think that question, that fundamental question of like who we are as Americans, play into this like polarization of our parties?
Well, I think it's a huge problem, and I think a lot of this you can lay at the foot of Donald Trump, though you have to lay it at Republicans because Republicans accepted Donald Trump. I mean, when Donald Trump came out for a Muslim ban, the Republican Party should have come forward, Reince Priebus should have come forward and said, look, we can't stop you from running, but this is not who we are. And the Republican Party is not going to support a candidate who's for a religious test. It's unconstitutional. It's against what we are. They did the same thing when that nutty guy in Missouri was a Republican nominee for Senate and said these crazy things about rape. They said, we're not going to support this person. But they didn't. And there's been just, so now what do we have? You know, all of a sudden the White House is debating like slavery and whether or not slavery caused the Civil War. I mean, really? If, like the chief of staff of the President of the United States is talking about like slavery? And I think we've just gone backwards. I mean, we have not neo-Nazis and, you know, the good people on both sides. And I think these words have impact. And I think it definitely emboldens those who have a lot of hate in their heart. I mean, it's like, you know, there's always been bank robbers. Bank robbers will continue. If you had a president of the United States who was a bank robber, it probably would raise, like, people would think bank robbers aren't that bad. I think it affects things, and it's very troubling.
I agree, and I think these issues that we're dealing with now, to me, I go back to what I told my daughters in 2016, and it's like the way to get the roaches out so you can kill them is to turn the light on and they start scurrying. I really feel like we're going through a process in America that we have to go through every 100 years or so. And now it's brown-skinned people that our president is demonizing. 150 years ago, it was the Irish. And before that, it was probably some other group. And eventually, they assimilated and became part of the fabric of America. And hopefully, brown-skinned people from countries south of the border will as well. But we have to make sure of that as American citizens. And in terms of looking at who we are, to me, you look no further than the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, which spell it out pretty clearly, and the Statue of Liberty that is standing in New York Harbor, and the message inscribed on that. So I think we just have to constantly be reminded of that as Americans.
I think that's a good high note to close on. We want to thank you for coming tonight. It's been a really interesting discussion. Stuart and David, thank you for joining us.